We're going to concentrate a lot on the past and how these things develop and why they developed and where they came from. You know, we learn from our history, don't we? And there's lots of things going on now that, nothing's new. The kind of technology we deal with is new, but the way you cope with it is usually the same. And I'll talk quite a lot about the history of my union. It's interesting, there's going to be a book published in next month in September. And it's been the researchers at the University of Glasgow in Scotland have decided to write the history of the first 120 years of the British Musicians Union and the ups and downs, a lot of downs, some pretty good ups that we've had to deal with. And it really is a chronicle of performance, all sorts of performance, recorded, live performance, theatre performance, gigs, orchestras, everything you can imagine is going to come out of there. So, this is going to be a little bit of general stuff now about trade unions, about guilds and everything, and how come the musicians ended up with one. So, the definitions of trade unions are sort of difficult to come by. Different academics have different views of it. Organised collectives of people working within a given sector. Our sector's music, of course, and it's performance of music, which through negotiation aim to improve paying conditions. There's a problem with that general definition. That could apply to transport workers, it could apply to workers in lots of different industries. But to negotiate, you've got to have somebody to negotiate with. And the problem in our sector is often you haven't, because there's so many different employers. When I did Status of the Artist yesterday, that was one of the things, the barriers to actually taking this profession forward. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. So, trade union is definitely a representative democracy. You can't have mass meetings of the whole members to make decisions. You've got to have a system of governance. So it's governed by its members and it's administered by an internal democracy. I'll say more about that in a minute. Come on. Yeah, so trade unions usually have to be registered with a governmental body. We have to do that in the UK. We have to provide returns. In fact, the law governing trade unions is a lot more strict than it is governing companies. That goes back to good old Mrs. Thatcher, who wanted to really have a go at people like me. But we have to register the interests we look after. And it's particularly the case in the US and Europe. This registration doesn't happen in some other countries. Funnily enough, in Africa, where you've got some quite authoritarian regimes in some countries, it's more free and easy when it comes to this. So how does the governance work? And it's generally there has to be a representative body. Now, people call it all sorts of things. General Assembly is used by lots of my European colleagues. Convention is what the Americans call their meetings, Congress or conference. My union has a conference every 2 years. It's not going to happen this year. This is the fallow year. It's going to take place next year. The American Federation of Musicians has a convention every 3 years. And they just had theirs just a couple of months ago. So it takes place regularly, but not too regularly. You know, you can't be moribund by administration, which is a danger. And what happens, the delegates are asked to elect, to be elected. The members are asked to elect delegates to the conference or the Congress. Now, you can do this in all sorts of ways. You can do it on a geographical basis, and that's the way we do it in the UK. The union's divided into 6 regions around the country, and they all have an allotted number of delegates, depending how many members belong to that region. The other way of doing it is you look at genres of music and you make sure you get the coverage from each genre. So you could have, we've got committees that deal with all sorts of music. You could have jazz musicians, recording musicians, folk musicians, classical musicians, and importantly, like I said yesterday, musicians who teach, because I think it's very important for them. You have the equivalent of a board, which we call the executive committee, executive council in some countries. This is elected on that same basis as the delegates to the Congress. It could be geographical, it could be what I call industrial. So the different kinds of branches of music within the industry. They're limited to a term of office. They have to apply for re-election every 3 years, so you keep that turnover. And we do it on an alternating system, so we've got one lot do their 3 years and another lot sort of coincides. So they don't all come up for election at the same time. It alternates. So you've continuity, but you've also got change every year. According to the rules of my union, that executive has all the powers of the union. So it's not me, I'm the general secretary, I kind of head the union, but I've got to go and ask permission of the actual musicians to actually make policy. But the individual executive committee members don't have any power at all. They have the same power as any member of the union. It's only when they get together in the committee that they get that power. So it's a collective, again, this is all to do with collectivism. It's a collective decision-making body. And that's what makes it very powerful. So this is the role that I fulfilled in the UK. The head of the unions are usually called general secretaries. In the USA, it's presidents, chief executive of the union. There are many ways of doing this. In the UK, it's governed by law. So I have to get elected by a ballot, and it's a postal ballot. You have to do it by mail, which is very expensive, every 5 years. My colleague in the States gets elected at the convention every 3 years. And it's a kind of, and by acclaim this time, so nobody stood against him. So it's, he's got another 3 years there. So we have to make sure that that part of it is democratic. You're accountable to the members. And I think the whole thing depends on democracy. You've also, let's get these up. You also have an important role as with the chairman of the executive. Now, I use chairman, but it could be a woman. We had a woman until last year. So, but I don't like the word chairperson. And then I did have a colleague who didn't like being called a chair. So, you know, that's a chair. It's sort of, yes. So terminology can get really difficult. But they chair the meetings of the executive. They keep order. Very important. They can be the figurehead. They can talk to the press. They can give statements. And we've got, in my union, we've got 3 vice chairs. There could be vice presidents. And that forms the day-to-day administrative committee. They're the ones that I contact in between meetings, say, look, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, can we do this? Do you think we ought to do this? That kind of question. So, again, the democracy runs through everything. So specifically for the UK, and this is terminology used by the broadcasters, they talk about the talent unions. So our colleagues are equity, who look after actors, dancers, variety acts, circus performers, and they actually have singers there. We'll come on to singers later. There is a little bit of a dispute about singers. It's interesting. They have lots of very niche things to look after. Dancers are very different to look after the musicians and have very different problems. They look after stuntmen in the film industry, which can be quite hazardous. When you actually go, they had a dispute once about, they were making a movie about horse racing. And in the contract, it said that any horse riding had to be done by the stuntmen. And these are big guys, you know. Because a horse racing jockey is a very small guy. He gets on the racehorse. So they demanded that they did the riding on the horses, and they had proper jockeys lined up. So we had to get a compromise. I think in the end, Equity negotiated that they got a payment and didn't ride the horses. So it was, honour was satisfied. So yeah, so it's a very different union to the Musicians' Union. The other one we're quite close to is the Writers' Guild of Great Britain. There's also a Writers' Guild in the USA. Quite powerful. These are small unions, but these are really important people who write the scripts for TV programs, or write the scripts for stage plays, write the scripts for movies. And I think it was the Writers' Guild of America that went on strike last year or the year before and almost froze the Hollywood studios. And then there's us. And I put down instrumentalists, music writers. I've used the term carefully there because a lot of the work we do is for arrangers, and it's for copyists, the people that sort of copy out. And often when you're doing big sessions, film sessions for instance, in big studios, they're copying the music as the musicians are playing. So they're actually quite skilled, because you've got to be able to read it. So we do a lot of work for them. And then instead of singers, I put vocalists to make that distinction, because the very, very loose demarcation between us and Equity About Singers is if it's primarily a band with instrumentalists with a vocalist, then they belong to the Musicians Union. If it's a band that's primarily singers, they tend to go in with Equity. It's not that simple. A lot of them have got dual membership, particularly the session singers who work in the studios. So, let me tell you a little bit now about my union. As I said, it's very old, formed in 1893. It has to take the initiative of somebody to be formed. And I told you yesterday about the circular that went around. And this was the 7th of May, 1893. There'd been a couple of incidents. It was all based in Manchester, a very industrial town. And what had happened at that time in the UK and a lot of Europe and in North America is that they talk about the second industrial revolution. This is when industry was getting going. This was when Karl Marx was writing his books about how people were exploited in the factories. And there was a big movement in the few years before then from the countryside into the cities. Charles Dickens writes about it a lot. It's all fascinating stuff. But the social movements were really... people were in a bad way. And they actually formed into unions to try and improve their own lot. There'd been another movement earlier in the 19th century. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Tolpuddle Martyrs. These were agricultural workers, and they formed a group to look after themselves against the landowners. What they did, they kind of swore allegiance to each other, that they'd support each other, back each other, and look after each other. The authorities said that was swearing an oath and is against the law of the Crown. They were transported to Australia. They were just taken away from their families and sent off. 2 of them came back. But yeah, it was pretty heavy duty. So all this was going on, and the musicians were unhappy about what was going on, particularly, as I said, the theatre musicians. This all started with the theatre musicians, which was a really popular form of entertainment in those days. They were really concerned with what was going on. There were attempts to form groups in some of the big cities, Birmingham and in Manchester in the 1870s, but it didn't come to anything because nobody would kind of organise it. Nobody would actually take the initiative. And it's difficult, I think, because musicians are performing. It's actually quite hard. But then this circular was put together. It's put together by this clarinet player called Joe Williams. He was very young. He was only about 23. And the story is that his mother, Katie, was the one that really drove and wrote this letter and got him to do this and was the driving force. Now then, considering you've got the gender session tomorrow, this is very 19th century and gender specific. So it starts, gentlemen, which it would, wouldn't it? The phrase "we ought to have a union" is often uttered by musicians, especially when they're compelled, for want of society, to rehearse without remuneration. Unfortunately, with the phrase, the matter drops. In other words, they just talk about it. No one seems inclined to start a union, yet on all sides it's admitted that one is necessary. The union we require is a protecting union, and one that will protect us from amateurs, protect us from unscrupulous employers, and protect us from ourselves. A union that will guarantee our receiving a fair wage for our engagements, a society that will keep the amateur in his place and prevent his going under prices. A union that will see you are paid for extra rehearsals and in time raise salaries to what they ought to be. So there were real grievances there, and they had a big issue about people going in and undercutting them. And that happens now, you know, like I said before, nothing really changes. The union grew very quickly. By the end of the 1890s, there were about 3,000 members across the UK, mainly based in the big cities, and it grew really powerfully before the First World War. By the time we get to the 1910 to 1912, there are about 20,000 members. And then the first really big incident comes along, and I'll just tell you about this because it's a great story, I think. You've all heard of the Titanic, and when the ship went down, the band played on. Some people think it's an apocryphal story, but there were lots of witnesses that said that what happened is The boat was going from Southampton in the UK to New York. It hit an iceberg in the North Atlantic. It was brand new. They said it was unsinkable. It was the state-of-the-art transport at the time, and it was going under. And the band actually got their instruments out, and they stood on the deck while people were going into the lifeboats. And they actually played through their repertoire. Now, the story is that they were playing some ragtime until the water went over their feet. And then the leader of the band, who was a guy called Wallace Hartley, who came from the north of England, from Burnley in Lancashire, he was a devoutly religious man, and he was sort of waiting for this moment, and he decided he had a number of hymn tunes that he thought they should play at that particular moment. And the story is that the tune they played is Nearer My God to Thee, as the final lifeboats were going down, and people that couldn't get on the lifeboats were having to jump in. The band actually packed their instruments up when all the lifeboats had gone. And the story again is that Hartley decided that one of the great loves of his life was his violin. And he strapped the case on the front of him before he jumped into the water. You're jumping into the North Atlantic, this is cold water. And again, the story is that when he was found, the violin case was there, and it disappeared for years. Recently, somebody said they'd found it. Now, I think I'm not sure how the verification of that happened, but it was sort of taken away. His body was repatriated to the UK, and he had a very formal ceremony in the north of England where he came from. And there's a memorial there to him as the band leader of the Titanic. There were 8 musicians, and they were all members of what was then called the Amalgamated Musicians Union. Wallace Hartley was the leader, as I said. It's quite an interesting, the makeup. For that, particularly those times, there was a cellist called Roger Brichot, who started working in the casinos in the south of France. He worked in Monte Carlo, the casino. He ended up in Liverpool. Now, I don't know how that happened in those days. It would be odd enough now. So he was a young man who actually started to work in the UK. There was a guy called Theo Brayley, who was a pianist but a multi-instrumentalist. He was a Londoner. There was Wes Woodward, was another violinist who actually, and all these guys worked on the ships. They worked on the boats, and they earned quite a good living doing that. We had another Frenchman called Georges Crin, who actually spent most of his life living in Belgium. He was another cellist. John Clark and Percy Taylor. And then there was a young man called John Law Hume, who was only aged 20. He was the youngest of the band. He was a violinist, and he was a kind of joker with the pack, evidently, so they say. There's a tragic story. There's a tragic story about a number of them, but with John Hume, he'd got on the boat. He was obviously a talented musician. He didn't have an instrument, so he rented 2 violins, and he actually got on the boat with them. He left. The idea was he was going to earn some money, because these guys did earn quite good money. They got tips as well. You remember, very rich passengers on these liners. And he was going to go back to marry his fiancée, who was pregnant at the time. So he was killed in this shipwreck, and his body was never found. But in the week after the tragedy, his father got a bill from the White Star Line, which was like Cunard, it was the actual shipping line, for alterations made to his band uniform. They sent him the bill, and insensitive or what? It was really ridiculous. And there are other stories like that as well. Just to finish off Hume's story, the baby was born, and his family disowned the girl. They didn't want anything to do with her. The money they paid, they got compensation eventually. I'll talk about that in a minute, because it pertains to the life of a musician. The money came, they paid it to the father, and he wouldn't pass it on. She went to the union. She wasn't a member. Remember, she wasn't a musician. And they took it to court, and we actually took the father to court and got her just compensation for that. And I don't know what the dad did about the bill for the clothes. But yeah, so, this was a real tragedy in every way. But when it came to it, they were looking for compensation. The employees of the shipping line, the merchant sailors, the stewards, the people who worked in the bar, the cleaners and everything, had a kind of compensation system. Very primitive in those days, not like hopefully there is now. The musicians didn't, because the musicians were employed by an agent based in Liverpool. And this agent was always putting bands onto the ocean liners, also bands into theatres, into holiday resorts, into hotels. They were quite active. It was Charlie Black was the name of the agent, and it was him and his brother that ran it. And they'd had run-ins with the Musicians' Union in those days because of the way they treated the artists. When it was looked at by the courts, the contract was between the agent and the musicians, not between the White Star Line and the musicians. So the pot of money, and this had money that was given by the government as well, didn't apply to them. So initially they weren't going to get any compensation whatsoever, their family and their children. The union did a number of things. It created merry hell. It really raised the roof and was in all of the press about this, about the unfair treatment of musicians. It held what I think is still the biggest concert, an aid of any kind of tragedy, probably Live Aid, because of television, went over that. But it was at the Albert Hall, the Royal Albert Hall in London. It had a load of musicians, popular musicians from London at the time, 3 symphony orchestras. There's a picture of this massive thing, the orchestra on stage and the audience in Edwardian dress. And they raised quite a lot of money, primarily for the musicians. And that went there, and it kind of highlighted this employment chain. And there again, that's something that hasn't changed. That's the same. You often get musicians thinking they're employed by somebody, but they're not. They've been engaged by somebody else, which is back to what Keith was talking about earlier. Read the contract. Make sure you know who you're working for. So the union was very involved with that. That was 1912. Then we had the war in Europe. It was a lot of musicians enlisted. The membership went down, but it kind of stabilized. And there was the time in the 20s was quite an active period. And then they were hit by one of the most serious crises they ever faced. And that was because at that time, theatres had kind of gone away. They weren't as popular as they were before, but cinema was, and it was mainly silent films. And there were big orchestras employed in movies. And it's not, often you'll see something on TV and it's, somebody playing a piano. That wasn't always the case. That was maybe in very small towns. In the big towns, and in London, there was 2 cinemas, one in Leicester Square and one near Edgware Road, which is kind of northwest London. They had over 100 musicians on contract. And what would happen is the movies were almost exclusively made in America. The scores would go across on the ocean liners. The musicians would rehearse them. They'd perform in the evening. There'd be about 8 shows a week, sometimes more. And it was a very good living for them. Then in 1927, there's a film called The Jazz Singer. And that was the first talking movie. And all work stopped. They were put out of work almost overnight. And the membership of the union went down from about 25,000 to about 12,000, or even less. Half the musicians put it out of work. And it's quite funny because the history of the British Musicians Union and the American Federation of Musicians is a fight against technology. And there's lots of publicity material in cartoons saying the public are going to get back to their senses soon. Who wants all this talking? Who wants this? Get proper films back for them. And of course, you're fighting a battle you can never win. But it's interesting because when one door closes, and some people say another slams in your face, but actually often a door does open, and it was broadcasting that came on board. So suddenly there were lots of opportunities for broadcasters in the late 1920s. So it's kind of, that's been repeated. And, we talked a lot about streaming yesterday. These are the same things happening again. Technology's changing. The way you earn your living is changing. What we're talking about yesterday is that musicians earn less money because of the nature of streaming and the price of streaming. Well, that was the same then, right back in the 1920s. So it's a fascinating thing. It's why I say you have to try and learn from your past. So yeah, so there were two organisations. The organisation I'm talking about is the Amalgamated Musicians Union, which is the one based in Manchester. The national, which became the National Orchestral Association, was a bit snobbish. It was the orchestras. They didn't really want to associate with the theatre musicians and the sort of hotel musicians. They kind of regarded themselves as an elite, but they went bust, and they couldn't survive as an elite. They were quite small. They merged in 1921, and the orchestral musicians, more or less about the same percentage today with my union. We're sort of less than 10% of the full thing. So it just shows what the cross-section was. So back to the way to summarise on the governance. So my union now, members elect the executive committee by postal ballot, elected by the regions. Members elect the general secretary by postal ballot, 5-year period. Members elect delegates for a conference every 2 years. Then the general secretary is responsible for appointing all the full-time officials and staff of the union who actually administer it. And we've got about 50 people working for us in the UK, across the country, about 30 in London, because that's where the main part of the union is, the music industry is. So the 6 regions, Scotland, Northern Ireland, we bumped them together, so we don't regard them as countries, we regard them as regions, and they're okay with that, just. The north of England, which is a massive part, right across the top of the north, from those of you who know the UK, Newcastle, down to sort of Chester, Carlisle, down to sort of Lincoln. The Midlands, those counties in the centre of England, Wales and southwest England, and southeast England, outside London. London's a region of its own, and a third of our members live in London, live and work in London. So the committees, they all have committees. There are 6 regional committees, again elected by ballot, and the regions elect their delegations to the conference, like I said. On top of that, we've got sections. Now, we kind of rejigged the sections recently because we did have them more by genre, and we had a jazz section, we had a folk section, folk and roots music section, we had an orchestral section, we had a theatre section, and they got kind of exclusive rather than inclusive. They were keeping people out rather than letting people in. And then we decided to rejig it and look at the way people work. So a jazz musician and a folk musician does the same kind of work, basically. They might do a little bit of recording. They mainly do live performances. They kind of work in the same venues. So we decided that this is the best way to follow the type of work rather than genre of music. Open to all members. They can elect to go into more than one section, though they've got to nominate what their main one is. They get a newsletter just for that section. So if it's live performance, they get issues twice a year just to do with live performance. They elect their own committees as well. I'm full of committees. I've got committees coming up in my ears. And they advise and they recommend, as I say. They don't make decisions. Then we still have sort of industrial sections. And we've got musicians who work in recording broadcasting, musicians work in live performance, orchestras. We've got an equalities committee, which I'll say a bit more about that later. Doesn't really sit in with this structure, but there's nowhere else to put it. And we got a very important teachers section, which is the biggest one in the union.
Sorry, John.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of having these different industrial sections, maybe you'll speak to the governance structure later, but how do you ensure that one isn't dominating?
Yeah, a good point, yeah. I think the way that's ensured is that the decisions can only be made by the executive. So like I say, they make recommendations only. So you can get kind of dominant personalities or push issues through, looking after themselves, which could disadvantage musicians working in other fields. So the executive has to keep that balance. And it kind of works. There's lots of arguments, but it does work generally. The equalities is interesting. We look at what they call the protected characteristics. And you're going to talk about gender tomorrow. And that's a really important issue. I think I said yesterday that the makeup of my union and lots of similar ones around the world tend to be mainly men. The union fluctuates 3/4 to 1/4, men, women, sometimes 2/3, 1/3. And it's been like that for years and years and years. it's strange because when you look at the employed situations, so you look at people that work in theatres in West End of London, you look at people who work in the orchestras, the gender balance is actually pretty good. And that wasn't, when I was a young musician, that wasn't the case. It was all men as well. But that's changed. But you know, it's the other genres, it's rock and pop, it's jazz, it's folk as well, that tends to be the guys in the band and the girl as the vocalist. I think I did meet a music ethnologist once, and she'd written a paper on why is the girl always the singer. And it's interesting, because when you look at the makeup of bands, it's changed a bit, but generally it's still the same. So we look at that. Very important in the UK, we have to look at ethnicity. So we've got our black and minority ethnic part. And we actually have a number of musicians who come in and talk about how they get on in the business. Are they discriminated against? Generally, I think in music, in the performance of music, they're not. I think it's quite eclectic. If you're a good performer, you're a good performer. It's the women, I can't really explain the women-man thing, the gender thing, why that happens. And we've spoken to musicians, but we give them the opportunity at this committee to raise the issues they want to raise. And it's quite important to have that. Sorry. And then we got the LGBT, we got the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual. They've got to have a voice. They have some real issues. There's issues about discrimination when they're touring. They've faced all sorts of things. We try and raise the profile of the issues they bring to us. And probably the most tricky thing that we deal with is the disabled musicians. We've got to ensure people have good access to venues. And you know, when you're looking like a city like London, a city like New York, there's some great music venues there, some great theatres, some great concert halls, but you know, they're old. And it really is, the access really can be quite difficult. I was talking to musicians who are working in the West End of London doing the Phantom of the Opera. And that's a musical that's been on in London and toured the world for years now, 25 years. It's a theatre called Her Majesty's. It's in the centre of London. It's an old Victorian theatre. It's a beautiful building. The orchestra pit is almost buried. If there was a fire, it'd be bad enough for the able-bodied musicians to get out. Anybody who's disabled, you burn. You know, it really is bad. So we have to bring... Now, what we don't want to do is close that theatre, because, you know, our members wouldn't thank us, and neither would the public. So we've got to try and get the compromise. And we work with a number of other organisations. There's one called Attitude is Everything. And they kind of look at it from the audience point of view as well. Access to venues for the disabled audience. And they send out secret shoppers. So people go along and they just test it and they do a report. Which is quite good. It's quite good when you send the report to that venue. It's a big job, and things are changing, and it's something the union's very much involved with. Then we've got to communicate with our members. We've got to keep the message coming across, you know, that there are things happening they need to know about. I think you've got a copy of the latest edition of the Union Journal, Musician, in the pack that we sent. So you can see from that we try and cover every different kind of music, lots of different issues. We kind of took a little bit out politics. We talk about where we're going with any policy that we have. And it's good. It's a good publication. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's quite valued by them. It's really expensive to produce, but, you know, something we should do. We're using electronic communications much more now than we used to. We've got email addresses, we know live email addresses, good email addresses, because they fall off the end, email addresses, very quickly, for about 3/4 of our members. So we know that we can get in touch with most of them through email very quickly. And then you've got the book, this book here. Now, if you haven't got a copy, we've got PDFs that you can actually access. This has got all of the information you could possibly need in it. It's got admittedly perfunctory stuff, but it's got everything about the contracts we heard this morning. It's got about other things we talked about. It's advice about filling in your tax return. It's advice about how you look at your merchandise. It's advice about how you actually have govern your whole career as a musician. It's revised every year. I think we're going to send it every 2 years in future instead of every year. But it's great. It's won a couple of awards. The Trade Union Congress, TUC in the UK, where all the unions belong to, given this an award as one of the best services that you can actually give to them. And we make it this size so they can slip it into an instrument case. You can get this into a guitar case. You can get it in the drums. So if you're not sure, reference it. It's also got the phone numbers, you know, that they can get in touch with the office with. So that's quite important. The website, of course, everybody's got websites. You have to renew them often. You've got to keep them going. I'm not sure. It's the worst thing you can do is have a website and have it out of date, because they pick up on that. The information's got to be completely updated. So I've got one official who just deals with electronic communications, social media, and electronic media, basically. And she's really good. She's the youngest one. She's 27. She's actually magnificent. She does things that I just don't understand how they work, you know. But she's great. So yeah, and also the regions and the sections, I think I mentioned this, do have their own newsletters. On top of that, we've got to use social media. So the Twitter hashtag is WeAreTheMU, and we sort of send stuff out every day to members. Facebook page, you know, that can vary where people moan. And they moan about, you know, life's not treating them well. You've got to watch Facebook, I think. It's sort of, it's prone to that. And Instagram, things that you're all very familiar with, I'm sure. Then we have to talk about jurisdiction. And this is quite interesting because there are areas that we have to be careful with. So, what we look after are the performers in the intellectual property rights that can be acquired through collective bargaining. I talked about the sync agreements and the agreements we've got with the record industry, that the performances can only be used, the recorded performance can only be used for certain things. If there are any other things, then they've got to actually pay some extra money. And that works very well. We have the same thing with the film industry in the UK, and those agreements apply to producers from other countries, like the American producers who come and record music there in London. We generally look after the non-featured musicians. So it's the orchestra musicians, the theatre musicians, the session musicians, when we're talking about collective bargaining. When we're talking about the bands that work on their own, there's nobody to bargain with. There's no employees association or anything. The American Federation have got an agreement with the hoteliers. So there's a number of hotel chains. We haven't got that, mainly because they all belong to Americans. So it's sort of difficult to kind of get hold of anybody to negotiate. So what we do in that case, we tell them what they should get paid, what an average rate is, and what a fair rate is. So it's a unique role. I talked about how we sit in the trade union movement. None of them do this. So Intellectual Property Rights Administration, those sync fees, somebody's got to actually collect them and pay them out to the musicians, and we do that. We actually have a department that looks after royalties, and they'll collect anything that's generated by their exclusive rights. Remember, Keith was talking yesterday, there are exclusive rights, and there's equitable remuneration right, and the moral rights. Well, the exclusive rights are a reproduction of their performance. So a sync is actually a reproduction of the initial performance in another product. And we collect the money for that and send it out to them. Debt recovery service. Well, a debt recovery service is when you don't get paid for the gig. And we are very litigious, our union. We're in the courts all the while, virtually every day, often chasing just a few £100 for the fee. And this is when the band have done the gig, and they've probably done it in a pub in some dodgy part of a dodgy city somewhere. And at the end of the evening, the manager, the landlord, says, "You were rubbish, off," you know, and they don't get paid. So it's down to us to actually chase that money for them. And we are almost always successful. We tend not to take things on we're not going to be successful with. The standard contracts, Keith was using a lot of the standard contracts. I think you sent them around, Keith. That what we do with those, we've kind of put them together and looked at the subject matter. We think we covered everything, and then we get a firm of lawyers that we use just to look at them, check them over. They are skeleton contracts. These are the very basics, and as Keith said, they're very artist friendly. Of course, we would be, but that's the starting point. That's where they have to go from. On top of that, we've got a contract advisory service. Now, this is the artist can come to us with a management agreement, they can come with the recording contract, with the publishing contract, and we have an agreement with a firm of lawyers, and they'll take the contract and they'll read through it, and they'll redline it, as the lawyers in the room know. They'll go through it and they'll say, this needs altering, that needs altering. Usually that's enough, because they can go back to the actual record company or the publisher or whoever it is and say, look, I've been advised to change this, a little bit of a negotiation. Sometimes they have to go and talk to the lawyers separately, so then they have to pay. But I think they get the first look at the contract free, which is a pretty good service, because that's going to cost a band a lot of money to have that looked at. Now, partnership advisory service is pretty new. I was talking about this yesterday. One of the things we find is it's great when somebody's starting their career. It's great when the band's got together. It's great when they're doing really good things and everything's going well. What about, inevitably, when they fall out and they're not friends anymore? In fact, they hate each other after a while. There's a lot of examples of that going on. And the obvious thing is, who owns the songs? Who owns the copyright in the songs? Because often they've kind of cobbled them together, working in the studio, rehearsing. They don't know. Somebody will claim they own the songs, but then there'll be a dispute. But it's even more basic than that. Who owns the band van? Who owns the transportation? Who owns the PA system they use? We've had examples of somebody's dad has given them some money to buy a good PA system and given it to the band. Now they say that's a gift. And the courts have to decide who that actually belongs to when it falls apart. And of course, when you sell it second-hand, it's got no value at all. It's sort of, the whole thing is really sad. So what we try and do is get them to sign a prenup. So they come together, they're all pals, they're all friends, and they sign this agreement about the division of the property the band owns. And by property, I include the songs and the music that they've written. How that might be divided if, or should we say when, they all split up. And it's quite interesting, because what you get these days is a lot of bands reforming when they get into their middle age. There's lots of bands touring now that were very popular when they were young, and they kind of all start to speak each other again, because there's money in it. They've got a following. But we try and emphasize that this is something you should do. Just don't give money to the courts and to the legal profession. Much as we love the legal profession, try and bypass it by doing your own agreement and be sensible. They're not, by the way. We get it, it's used very little. And we've had bands come into the office and sit at opposite sides of the table screaming and shouting at each other. And we kind of start off being the referee, and we sort of end up being the football and kicked by both of them. So it's a thankless task. So that's my advice to young bands, just look to the future. Then we offer, as a really good service, some insurances, and I'll go into this in the second presentation a bit more. Public liability, they get free insurance up to £5 million, and instrument and equipment insurance free up to the value of £2,000. They can supplement that after that. So, the union is this collective body. It actually has collective responsibility. Everybody's part of the decision-making process, or potentially can be part of it. It oils the wheels. It stops disputes. It nips things in the bud by having the union there. And this is not my quote, but this is a quote from an academic who's written on industrial relations. What they also do are they're the managers of discontent. Because, people aren't happy with their working lives often, and they do have quibbles and little moans. We're there to kind of be a buffer for that and to absorb it, so that when they get out there working for their record companies, working for their publishers, everything's hunky-dory, or as hunky-dory as it can be. And it's a voice for the artisan musicians, the jobbing musicians, as I call them. So that's that first presentation, and that's sort of background to what these organisations are. I suppose the only thing I was going to add to the presentation is how you actually form this. What do you start? Who makes the first effort? And the example, my example, goes way back 120 odd years. But that's the same now. You need somebody to take an initiative. You need somebody to take responsibility. It's best if it's a small group. and to explain to the others that this is the way to go forward. You need to have this collective voice, and you need to be able to talk to the authorities and to actually go to government and to say you represent the musicians, and but you also represent the musicians in the industry as well. So you've got this whole kind of infrastructure that's there supporting you. You're out there performing, somebody's got your back, and that's the important thing about it. Erica.
Can you just briefly say what you're going to address in the next session to guide my intervention right now?
Right.
Please?
I'm going to go on to talk about exactly what we do, the services, and how they work.
Okay.
So the services and benefits, and what they really mean to the individual musician.
All right.
In the next one. But we can have a quick 5-minute break if you like.
Right. No, I'll make the intervention now before we move on there. Because, well, as you may have guessed, what we're hoping to encourage is the formation of a functioning body. Let's call it that vaguely for the time being. But essentially to undertake some of what John will be speaking on in the next session. So I'm asking that you pay particular attention if you have an interest in that. And before you leave, if you sign up your name to indicate the interest, so that when we have, it's not going to be a cost cap organization. It's just we would facilitate the development. And of course, John will mention the International Federation of Musicians, and we will get some technical support there. Right, John? Yeah. Right. So you have to give some thought as to what you would want it to do, coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to make that intervention now. And like I said, if you sign up, then when we do the follow-up conversation, we would reach out to you.
Thanks,
and
Eric.
So, John, I would also ask if you can maybe speak in some detail as to governance and funding, financial sustainability. All right, thanks.
Yeah, let's deal with that now. I talked about the way my union is governed. Part of it is dictated by law. You know, we're not allowed in the UK to use emails for a ballot because the law says you can't. And this is law made in the 1990s, and it's completely out of date. And it's very costly. It's cost a lot of money in the UK to mail 30,000 people. But we're trying to lobby to change that. There are many models of governance. I mean, when Williams started that union in Manchester in the 1890s, there were about 6 of them that were actually driving. They self-appointed. They were a self-appointed committee who got it going, drove it forward, used their enthusiasm to enthuse other people, and it was only when it got to be a bit more mature they managed to have structures that they could elect people. And in those days as well, they used to have mass meetings. People would go to a hall and they'd vote by show of hands. It was a lot less sophisticated. So there's many different models. What you have got to ensure is that everybody has a voice and nobody feels marginalised. And I think that's really important. And I think the great success of the British Musicians Union and of the American Federation is that we deal with all musicians. There are musicians unions in Germany, for instance. There's one body that will only do symphony orchestras, won't touch anybody else. Austria is very similar. We've got 2 musicians unions in Sweden, one just for orchestras, one for everybody else. This is no good, you know. When it comes to it, I said that we're very litigious and we're always in the courts chasing money, chasing breach of contract and fees for musicians. It's the same issue, whatever kind of music you play. You perform, you haven't been paid. You know, whatever kind of music you perform doesn't matter. And we've got to get over that thing. And it's like initially some of the musicians were snobbish about going with the other musicians. We get musicians now. A lot of our members are part-time. They voluntarily part-time. They want to do music as part of their work. They want to belong to the Musicians Union because it kind of helps them in their career, gives them a bit of kudos as well. And they're frowned upon by some of the full-time ones. You know, why do we want to be associated with these part-timers? So all of these things have to be overcome. And the only way you can overcome that is having a full and open structure. But in many ways, it has to evolve, and it evolves differently in different countries. Ours is very kind of rigid, as I said, governed by law and steeped in history. In a way, if you were to form an organisation now, and you've got enough people to make a small committee and give them the authority to go on with it, then that's the way to do it. You can find your own structures from then on as to how to be fair to everybody. Funding it is an issue because we're funded by subscriptions from the members, so they're paid to belong to it. That's why we have to make sure, and I'll come on in the next presentation, that we offer a really good service in return. And they know that they can get the service, they know they can get that contract work, they know they can get legal advice, they know they can get the insurances, and they know they can be represented. So you have to kind of, in the early days, it's a leap of faith, I suppose, that this is going to be the end game you're looking for. In some countries, the CMO does support the union. In Nordic countries.
So what sort of fees would the average member pay annually?
Yeah, in the UK it's about £200 a year, and they can pay monthly, or they can pay in one go. It's all, you know, or they can pay quarterly. That's an expensive union, so we know we are, which is why we have to work continually to keep it. No, not really. The question was, do the fees go up as we offer more service? It's we try and keep that. They go up kind of with inflation, but it's very low at the moment, so they're hardly moving at all. We try and we do deals, like for instance the contract advisory service that we do with a firm of lawyers. We do that deal with a firm of lawyers. We give them quite a lot of money, but we're looking to get that lower so we can actually, you know, balance that with what the members have to pay. So we're kind of experienced of that, but fees do have to go up, and they have done. What we used to do is charge different rates. I was talking about those part-time musicians. They used to pay less than the full-time ones, which kind of is obvious. But there's no way of monitoring this. This is an honesty box system, and people would always pay the lowest. You know, nobody would pay the high rate. They'd always pay the bottom rate. And that's kind of got them into conflict with the rules of the union, because if we had a legal case, they've got to be paying the right rate. So now we got one across the board, which I think is much better. So yeah.
And John, what's the legal structure?
Within the union, or the legal services we offer.
The legal structure of the union.
Yeah.
Is it a not-for-profit?
Oh, it's a not-for-profit organisation. It's an unincorporated society. Yeah, not-for-profit. Yeah. So we are registered, and you know, we have to be very careful in producing annual accounts. They're scrutinised by the government body. Questions are asked, so we have to be transparent, a bit like CMOs now. You have to make sure everything's accounted for. We get commission from those royalties that we get, so there's some, yeah.
So could you just give us an idea of what percentage of your income that
It's, yeah, yeah. We have, yeah, 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 yeah. We have about 50, so we kind of look to have $4 million a year to provide those services, and the rest of it is kind of absorbed into buildings. Of course, we've got buildings across the country as well. That's expensive. Maintaining buildings is always expensive. We own the one in London and we rent the others, and it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, which is the best way to do it, you know. From the, yeah, it kind of, yeah, sorry. So the question was what percentage of the income of the union come from the sort of subscriptions from the members? It's it's difficult to say. I'm not the accountant, but yeah, I mean it's roughly 2/3. Yeah, yeah. We've got from the members, yeah, come in.
A third of your income.
A third of the income we have to raise from other sources. We've got an investment portfolio, so we've got investments. We've got a commission on the royalties we get. When we do a legal case, we recover costs. So there are other kinds of collective uses that you can actually bring money in. It's not easy. It's not easy because, for instance, legal fees go up all the while. It can be very expensive.
So how did you establish the fact that you do take a percentage of royalties? Where did that fall in, fall into the musician? Because obviously when the Musicians Union was started, it was to be a member of the union. But you've taken it, the union's taken it way beyond the scope of what it was supposed to be doing, and now you're collecting royalties. Please explain to us how that occurred and how, because obviously, sitting here, we have no union here.
Yeah.
Something needs to be done to protect musicians. I came here in 1986, and people were earning more money in the Gap in '86 than they do now. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So, but I don't believe that it would be sustainable with just a membership fee. I mean, everybody here, I heard lots of sighs and oomphs and ahs about £200. That's $500. We know we couldn't charge.
Yeah.
No, it's 500 at today's rate. But anyway, it was 600 before Brexit, but now it's 500. Well, correct. We're members of AME, but I don't want to go there. But we don't want to. You don't feel you want to waste your membership fee, right? I won't go any further than that. But so just sitting here, doing some sums in my head. Most of the musicians on the island couldn't even afford a couple of $100 to pay a membership fee, right? So that we would have to find other ways of getting income in, because it just wouldn't be sustainable with.
Well, when you look at the fact that we have the difference in economy.
I think that's right. One rule doesn't fit all. That's
Yeah,
the thing.
because of how our economy runs and the way funding is accessible to us, it would have to be a much more open inclusion where people could just sign up, and it would have to have a different way of funding it initially. Because my point about the AME wasn't the service that they offered, but that even we had a hard time paying that amount for a direct result of any kind. So it would, by the collective bargaining, I mean, the film people did this, other people have done it through the Caribbean, so that you can be part of the association, get the benefits, and then as you see the benefits arise, you can then maybe start to charge money.
That's right, and that's what happened. That's the story of the way it developed. When it started, they were volunteers. The people that actually formed it did it for love, and it's only when it grew and it grew and it grew, they had to have a structure. Now I'm talking about an organization that's 123 years old. So this has taken a long while, to get to where we're at. Can I just answer the question about royalties? It evolved again, because what happened was this income was being generated, and we would talk to film studios, and they had no central point to actually do the distribution for them. And they were delighted that we took the responsibility on. Then, of course, we had to think how we're going to administer this. So we actually charge, I think we charge an administration fee of about 12%. And on all those fees that come through. We've got, again, another committee, which wasn't on the slide. We've got a royalties committee, which actually decides that. So we make sure the members decide all of these things, when it's money out of their pocket. And that is a very sophisticated operation, and this is not going to happen here overnight, that's for sure. But something else that might be worth considering, and if we can roll out this information and these stories across the Caribbean, there are other countries that are federated, different countries, and this is an ideal part of the world. So you've got an organization that's bigger than just Barbados. Now, how you administer it, where it's based, the differences, the nuances in laws might be against you, might not work because of tradition and culture. But, you have to kind of be duck and dive a bit and be sort of inventive. How's this going to work? Sorry, you've been waiting.
I'll say this much in terms of funding of the association, if it does come into play. There's nothing wrong with coming together and lobbying the government for a subvention to run the association. There are associations within the creative industry that get a subvention from government. I wouldn't say which ones, but they do get a subvention from government.
Yeah.
Again, there's no association as it relates to music or musicians or artists. So obviously there's nothing going to be on the books
Yeah.
for them. So there needs to be that coming together of the collective to make a lobby to government for that support.
Really good point. And that does happen in some countries. And the example I can give is that there are unions, musicians' unions, in Latin America, for instance, good example, where they go to their government and they say, look, we're going to organise your music education in the schools for you. We know it's not very good at the moment. We've got the musicians. We know how to deliver that. We're the experts. So we actually will take the responsibility. And the government fund it. And through that funding, they can work out the other little bits to actually make it work. So, yeah, I mean, this wouldn't happen in the UK because traditionally, particularly when it's a Conservative government, they hate unions and things like that. So they wouldn't ever give us any money. We have to be independent. But certainly there are parts of the world where that's a real possibility. But you have to, you're right, you have to get together, make a good case, a strong lobby. And, you know, I think you'll get some sympathy. Sorry, you've been waiting, haven't you?
It's about the royalties. I'm not really sure about how you collect royalties. Is the commission from, like, you say you do cases, so if you get a case, then you take a percentage of that commission, of that total, or is it that you collect royalties and then you distribute?
It's both. So if we did, I mentioned the Full Monty yesterday, when all those tracks weren't cleared, the rights weren't cleared, and we got a lot of money in that. And we actually had to do the research and find out which musicians were on which track and which ones we should pay. And that's what that fee was for, the commission. But we have agreements, for instance, with the BBC and with some commercial television companies, that when they sell their televisions, television programs to other territories, they, for certain sales, they'll pay it through to us. And it's paid out to the musicians, just because it's easier. What we also do is when we have these contractors who contract musicians for media sessions, when they die, when they move on, when they retire, we actually take over the portfolio from them. And there's quite a lot of recording takes place in London, and not just recording to make CDs, to record songs. This is commercial recording for films and TV and the like, which can be lucrative money. So we kind of positioned ourselves over a period of time as the go-to place to do this. And we have to justify what we've done to the producer. So we say, we give them a list of who we distribute it to. But it's easier for us to do it than them. We've also done agreements with CMOs. I told you, did I talk yesterday about renting CDs in Japan? I think I did. There's an income from that. And we're hopefully going to transfer that to PPL soon. But we've been administering that. And we get a percentage paid by the Japanese CMO Gadankyo, which we have. So there are so many different strands. But it can result from legal cases, but it can also be contractual. And it can come from the companies themselves. We got, with the commercials, TV commercials, we have an agreement with a collective bargaining agreement with the trade body. And part of that agreement is how they pay the musicians if it's originally commissioned and sourced music, so it's composed just for that commercial. A lot of music's done that way. Or if it's a track that's synced into the commercial, and it actually spells it all out, which is great. But yeah, I mean, this is, I have to keep emphasizing, this has taken years to get to this place, and we've had a rocky road there. And it's not foolproof now. You know, it's sort of, you're continually monitoring it. But yeah, and it's a good service to musicians, and it's a good source of income for the union. So we and we keep those commissions kind of the same as the CMOs. You know, we try not to take too much. Sometimes you like to take more. So, you know, we'll see. Sorry, David.
No, John, I was going to say that the discussion on how to fund an entity of that nature is an important one, but I don't think it's the discussion that needs to be had at this stage.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to focus your efforts around anything, it should be whether or not there's need for that type of an entity, and if that is the case, then what types of services that provide. My experience has always been when working with non-profit organizations, it's essentially how you class them. is that you must have diversified revenue streams.
Yeah.
And we have been in the past, we've been very successful at identifying revenue streams for entities that were 80 years in existence, but in the time and space were unable to subsist on just membership dues.
Yeah.
And there were things that were put in place that have made those entities viable and sustainable.
Yeah.
So there's a way to do it, but I think the discussion really has to be about, is it an entity that has a space within Barbados or the Caribbean? And if that is the case, then what are the types of services that you can really deliver?
And I think that's right, and I think that makes it quite difficult for me and for Keith to advise on that, because it's got to take place here, because you know what's happening here and how it might work. All we're telling you really is what the potential is and where you can go. Talking of which, do you want to go straight on, or shall we take 5 minutes comfort break? Let's take 5 minutes while I get the PowerPoint set up. You know how bad I am at that. So 5 minutes, and then we'll do the services one. Into a PowerPoint, but you know, you've got to be careful what font you use and what colour, because it just doesn't show, but it makes a change. I'm just going to say a little bit, and Erica mentioned it before the break then, about the International Federation of Musicians, FIM, Fédération Internationale des Musiciens. There's some leaflets here, tell you all about it. Now, you can't join this as individuals. This is organisations that join FIM, and they're about 60, 65 countries across the world that have musicians, unions, associations, guilds that belong to FIM, represented on every continent, and we do lots of campaigns. I think I mentioned yesterday the workshops we're doing in Latin America, which are quite exciting, and the ones in Africa are on capacity building. And we get experts to come and talk about health issues, and particularly issues that apply to individual countries where might not apply elsewhere in the world. We've done projects in Asia to try and help them to form their organisations. It's always been quite difficult. We've got a very good, solid member in Japan, and we've got another member in India. India is an incredible market for music, not only just Indian music, the classical Indian music, but there's an amazing film industry in Mumbai, and when I was there, I've been there with Keith. We've done sessions there, and one time I was there, we got a tour around the Bollywood studios, and we were taken to look at it, which was quite an experience. It was fantastic. So that's really an important market. We've got only one member in North Africa, that's Morocco. Again, very interesting to actually talk to them and the way they make music. A lot of European members, of course. We used to have a member in Jamaica, but we've lost touch. I don't know if you ever met Desmond, Erica, but I don't know what's happened. And I think it's maybe he retired, he was an artist, and it just, it needs the person that's running it, and he didn't have an infrastructure. I've got to say, they were a bit laid back in Jamaica, I've got to say, about the whole thing when we did our sessions in Kingston. So, applications come in all the while, yeah.
But I know you're streaming live, so.
Yeah.
I recently did a short stint in the Middle East, and what I realized is we brought only reggae music to them, but there is a market for really any genre, because there was the Jazz Lincoln Center, which is linked directly to the American counterpart or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear you say the amount of, you know, the different markets you're trying to tap into, because I think being there, I would not have known that they're like people that are accustomed to listening to like Arabic music, they're into other genres as well. I mean, like, I guess I was kind of ignorant on my part, but when you don't know, you don't know. But I was there and I saw it, so I was like just trying to figure out if that may be a market that you would be entering into as well.
It is, and but it's very difficult. It's a difficult part of the world to get into, and there is a musicians' union, a quite well-established one in Egypt, and they won't join the federation because we've got a member from Israel. So, you know, and you get involved in mega politics with this, and you know, and when I talk to them and I say, look, you know, they're all musicians. And you talk to one of those musicians, their problem's the same as you, and like I said before, you know, and the only way we get forward is get together and share experiences. But you know, it's yeah, we keep trying. This contact we've got in Morocco is quite helpful. He's a bit larger than life. He's very good. It's the only one meeting I've ever been to where they had simultaneous translation into Arabic, and it seemed like they were arguing with each other all the while, shouting at each other. But it was a great experience. So yeah, so we just had the World Congress. The World Congress happens every 4 years with the Federation, and that was in Reykjavik in Iceland just recently in June. It was great, and people can share experiences, talk about the policy, talk about where we should go. There was a lot of discussion about streaming and that issue. There was a whole session on gender in music. And we managed to get people from around the world. We had a session on health and well-being for musicians. And we had an incredible local expert from Iceland who's a young doctor who's done a postgraduate degree in performing arts medicine, which is a real rarity. And it's great because they talk about stresses to the back, they talk about mental health, they talk about problems, substance abuse, you know, all the things that we know goes on in the music profession. And it's great to know there are experts that are dealing with this. So through the Federation, we can deal with that. So there's some leaflets here to actually look at it. And I know that Eric has met the General Secretary of FIM, who's French, Benoit Marchuel. He's based in Paris and travels around an awful lot. And I go to a lot of places with him. The next place we go to is Sao Paulo in Brazil. We're guests of the International Federation of Actors. So we're going to kind of bring the fraternal greetings from the musicians to the actors. And again, when we come to intellectual property, a lot of problems are the same. So we need to sort of talk to the performers like that. Status of the artist, that project, is very much for actors as well. So look, I'll leave these leaflets here. But when you get to the stage where you think you might be able to form an organization, that's the go-to organization to go to talk about your own body, because they're used to forming unions around the world. They've helped an awful lot. I was involved when we formed one in Namibia, in the south of Africa, southwest Africa. We can advise, we can provide material, we can provide advice, of course, and sort of the wherewithal to do this. And I think what we do is give the confidence, you know, that other people have done this. And you know, there's no reason why you shouldn't if they did it. That kind of advice. So that's FIM, and I'm really pleased to be associated with that. So let's go on then. So some of this is going to be slightly repetitive, but it's going to be in more detail about what the benefits of the BMU, the British Musicians Union, are to members. So essential stuff. Been through this already. Pay bargaining, legal advice, contract advice, copyright advice, insurances, and health and safety. We've got people that are trained in health and safety. They're accredited with health and safety, government sort of accreditation, to go into venues, look at the lighting, look at the sound rig, and make sure that it's all safe, make sure the temperatures are right, make sure everything is working for the musicians. Essential services, campaigning and lobbying. So I'll come on to the political lobbying a little bit. But high-profile campaigns. This campaign I mentioned yesterday, this Work Not Play, where musicians complained about, been put upon, been, you know, almost blackmailed into working for free because it was a good cause, it was a good organisation, and you know they shouldn't charge a fee, even though everybody else is getting paid. and it was kind of respect for the profession of musician. That's been a great campaign that we've had. Well, we've had other ones. We have campaigns, one about new music education at the moment, that we want music education to be more accessible to kids from all backgrounds. We want really good quality tutors. And what we've done is bring the tutors together in certain parts of the country into cooperatives. So they're looking after themselves, they're administering themselves, they're actually self-help groups. And when a parent wants a teacher, they go to the cooperative rather than, you know, look in the phone book or something. So they get somebody who's got to sort of got accredited. And public awareness campaigns, we've got a public awareness campaign we're just about to start in the UK, and that's about government support for the arts, because there have been lots of cutbacks, and the arts are one of the things they cut straight away. And, you know, this takes away, it's what I was saying, that arts and culture is part of the society. I think it's a duty of governments to support arts and culture, and particularly their local art and culture, their own endemic art and culture. But the UK government and lots of other governments don't see it that way, and they want to rely on philanthropic, of rich people giving money to their certain pet organisations, and this is not good for the business, because we want an infrastructure to grow. So we want public awareness about, people love music, they really love music, they don't understand about the infrastructure of the music industry and how fragile it is and how it needs support. So we bang on about that, and I say bang on, it's a long job. I mentioned this before, we've got to, a lot of the communications to our members is to give them information about what's happening. You'll see in that magazine that's in the pack that there's some really interesting articles about various people, but there's a lot of information, up-to-date information about what they need to know to go about their own business as a musician. Training, professional development. This is something that hardly exists for a musician. And interestingly, the top bullet point there I put is stagecraft. Because, you know, it's not just a question of picking up your instrument. You've got to look right on stage. And I'm sure Keith, as a manager, would have experienced a lot of this, when the bands don't think that's part of the thing. It's not going back to the 1940s where they all put on the same jacket and they all had kind of a uniform. But there are certain ways you've got to treat your audience with respect, for a start. Or maybe the Sex Pistols didn't, but, you know, it's a general thing that you have to do. Self-promotion. You've got to be able to learn how to promote your band. You've got to be able to use, these days, social media to promote the band. You've got to be able to get out there. You've got to develop your fan base. Merchandising, we've spoken quite a lot about. Very important these days. Touring, you need to get a touring infrastructure. Usually that's quite difficult for bands to do on their own. So what we do, we point them to directions, then direction of promoters who might promote tours. And they can go as support acts often, and we can actually make the introductions and get them doing that sort of, and doing some quite interesting tours. And public relations, PR, you know, the general stuff, just getting information out there to the fans, doing blogs. People have a thirst for information, even if it seems stupid and puerile. They want to know, you know, so tell them what you have for breakfast, tell them what you're doing next week, where you're going for your holiday. Little things like that. And they're self-evident, but you know, you've got to tell people how to run their careers. So then we give financial advice. We talked about tax a bit as well. We tell musicians they've got to pay their taxes if they're going to be part of society. If they're going to get something back from the government, they've got to put something in. So we talk about how they keep their records. We actually give them classes in that. We have sessions on that, workshops. We talk about how they're going to have to invest, and their investments are mainly in themselves, their equipment, and how they make sure that they've got the best equipment they can get. And access to funding. There is access to funding for bands. There are regional development boards. There are the banks that they can go to. They've got to ask the question. You know, 9 times out of 10 they'll get turned away, but you know, that 1 time out of 10 they might get some funding, which really helps and assists them. And the continuing professional development, I think I mentioned yesterday, when we can actually bring them in and we can talk about how they develop their careers as musicians, how they sustain their careers as musicians. So we've got around the country maybe 1 a week of these sessions going on in various places. We try and repeat them when we've got a winning formula across the country, and people do travel quite a long way to get in there. This is just some of the campaigns we've had. Keep music live, you've got the button. I mean, that's, despite we've been talking about recording, you've got to have live musicians to record. What you don't want to do is have a machine doing it. We're not all that keen on computer-generated music, although it has its place, I have to say. Support My Music Teacher was an interesting one. That was kind of people whom they often have one teacher who really inspired them. Somebody that really put them on the right track. And you know, you've got to recognise that, and they ought to celebrate that, and we've actually tried to do that. Let It Be was the BBC campaign when the government was really attacking the BBC last year. BBC's is the biggest employer of professional musicians in the UK. It has the most incredible cross-section of genres, even though we complain about it bitterly and we argue with them a lot. It gives an unparalleled music service, and we want it to remain that way. Also, they commission new works, lots of new works from composers. It's one of the biggest commissioners of new works in the world. It supports festivals. It actually brings music into the house. We think there's not enough music on television, and we'd rather have it. The radio services of the BBC are pretty good. They've got 3 designated music services. 4 actually, with there's one digital one called Six Music, which has been very successful. So Radio's 1, which is a kind of younger people's one. Radio 2, Keith was mentioning yesterday, very popular across the age groups. Radio 3, which is classical, but it does world music and jazz as well. And Radio 6 Music, which is very quirky, it does everything. And to a really high standard, and music you don't normally listen to. So we joined with the rest of the music industry to try and make sure that we kept the BBC the way it was. Creating Without Conflict is an interesting one, because this was to do with, we joined with the other unions on this one, and there's a lot of pressure on artists when they're performing, and it can come from directors in classical music, it can come from conductors, actors get put under a lot of pressure to do things. There's bullying that goes on within the arts, and this is sort of raising awareness of it. In fact, even we do a lot of work with the Journalists Union, and they were saying how they get pressure at work to deliver for certain deadlines by their editors. And, you know, this is not pleasant. This is not pleasantly saying deliver it by tomorrow morning. These are threats. So we've raised the profile of that. So there are all sorts of areas that the unions can get involved in. And we do it with colleagues as well. So the legal assistance, the legal advice, most of the stuff we do is breaches of contract. I've already said it's when they don't get paid. That's a simple breach of contract. Copyright infringement, we follow that up, and we actually do have a good success rate on that. And defamation, we've actually done quite a few defamation cases when somebody says, oh, that band's rubbish, you know, which they're entitled to say, but when they say it publicly on a website or something, there are various things, degrees of how people treat each other. We've got to be very careful when it's one lot of members defaming or breaching the contract of another lot of members. We try and do this without going to the court, because the worst thing you can do is get before a judge and say, well, you're all members of the Musicians' Union, can't you sort this out? And then there's somebody like me saying, well, they're not reasonable, you know, they won't agree. So we've got people that are trained in mediation and dispute resolution. Banging heads together, you know, it really is telling them to grow up sometimes and to get on with it, because the worst thing for them to do is to get before the courts, and everybody loses, except the lawyers, of course. You've heard about this. This is the stuff that we advise on. We actually taught them about how to find work, how to make themselves available, session work, and then the final bullet point is the equitable remuneration, which is a very good source of income. We make sure that they register with PPL to get that money. They've got to actually mandate PPL before they can actually acquire it. So we give them advice on using new technologies, not new anymore, as I said, streaming downloads, YouTube, Spotify, Deezer, Pandora in the States, and the question marks mean what's next? We don't know. But we have to be prepared, and we try and be fleet of foot and to anticipate what the members are going to have to deal with next. It's difficult. We do end up a bit like those guys in the 1920s when they dealt with talking pictures and they tried to stop them. You're not going to do that anymore. That's not the way it's going to happen. The insurances I touched on before, I'll go into more detail now. Public liability is insisted on by lots of venues in the UK. Now, when a band goes to work in say, a hotel, so it's doing a gig, it's doing a wedding, the band has to provide its own public liability insurance. And this is really quite serious because we've had incidents when this insurance has been used where an amplifier stack fell off the stage, hit a member of the public, the band's liable. We had another one, a really bizarre one, when the band were working in a big hotel in the centre of London, but they weren't given any changing area. They had gear to put on, and they were told, use this corridor, typical, where they treat the bands, So they were used to it. They got their instrument cases. They kind of put their band shirts on, whatever it was. But they needed a bit of extra space. And there was one of these big trolleys where they stack the dirty plates and all the rest of it on. And they had wheels with brakes. So one of the musicians kicked the brakes off, moved this trolley away so he could get his guitar case down there, didn't put the brakes back on. So later in the evening, the band were performing, everything was happening at this dinner dance, everyone was having a good time. And this woman, who'd had a little bit too many glasses of wine or champagne, was looking for the ladies' restroom. And she mistook the door and she went out of the door towards the kitchens. She dislodged this trolley, it banged into her and broke a rib. The band was liable, but they were covered by this insurance. Just another story about that. We had a big country house in the English countryside. We're having this very sort of nice event. I think it was an art gallery, and they were selling pictures to rich clients. And they employed a harpist, and she was there, very elegant, playing the harp to all the people milling around on this sunny afternoon. She took a break, and she went for a walk around the grounds. Now, people can't resist plucking the strings of a harp when it's sitting there by itself. They go up and mess with it. So this member of the public went up and started to sort of tinkle away on the strings. I don't know if you know about harps, but they overbalance very easily. The centre of gravity is very difficult on the harp. It fell over and it hit a painting, which had a glass front to it, and it completely ripped the painting. Now, this painting was an 18th century sort of valuable work of art. The insurance covered her. So she was done. So all of this is provided as part of their membership fee, and the limit on it is £5 million. It's the kind of thing you hope nobody's going to use, but when you hear these stories, it could happen to anybody. These things just happen. So it's a pretty good benefit. And I think for a band to get that insurance individually, they'd be paying about £500 per gig almost for the band members. The only stipulation we say is they're only covered if all of the band belong to the Musicians' Union. That's right, you have to cover it.
So what you actually obtain the insurance for your members? Okay.
Yeah, we do a deal with one of the big insurance companies through a brokers we got. And it's quite an outlay that we have to spend for the policy every year. But it's proved it's worth every penny as far as we're concerned. And it gives them something tangible back. They're not all going to use the legal services because, most people work for legitimate engagers. But they all could potentially need this.
Cost is covered in the £200 a year?
Yeah. It's all covered in that. So it's a pretty good benefit of belonging to the union. The equipment insurance is something we developed. So what we give them is if they're a member, they get up to £2,000 insurance free as part of the membership. They can go to the people that we use for the insurances and top that up if they've got really valuable equipment. And this is great. This is used quite a lot. It's used for repairs because when things get... we had a trumpet player got his instrument knocked over and badly dented and all the rest of it. It wasn't expensive. It was a couple of £100 to repair, not into thousands, but that was covered. He was covered. So, yeah, it's a valuable... equipment insurance is a valuable sort of benefit. Personal accident, we've had a number of these. Musicians work weird hours. We've had a couple of people involved in car accidents late at night, whether they're falling asleep or whatever at the wheel, or with other members of the public. So we've got some lawyers on retainer who'll do those cases for them. And we've had quite a lot, surprising amount of cases. And then we provide cut price travel insurance. Obviously, it's travel insurance tailored to people working in music. Because you go to a high street shop, you go to somebody, you get out the phone book, and they don't really realise what you're doing and the kind of work you're doing. These are specialists. And medical insurance when they're working in other territories as well. So it's a pretty comprehensive package. So yeah, we mentioned most of this for live performances already. Let's go on to the lobbying now. We've got a parliamentary group that we administer jointly with those other unions I mentioned before, Equity and the Writers Guild. So the three, we call ourselves the Performers Alliance, and we have a parliamentary group, and we've got about 80 MPs and about 25, 30 members of the House of Lords. So over 100 parliamentarians who belong to the group. Now we hold meetings of the group, we provide speakers for them. We did a whole session on streaming. We got the guys from Spotify to come along, talk to the MPs. We got guys from arts funding organisations to come along to talk to them. We're going to have a session soon, and I'm going to be doing a lot of this, about royalties, because they don't understand. We've talked a lot the last 2 days, different strands of royalties. A royalty is not a simple thing. It can come from all sorts of different sources. Now, MPs don't know about that, you know. They need to understand the industry a lot more. So we've got this group of MPs who are friends, and we can call on, and we sort of, you know, we give them a party every Christmas. They like that. And we make sure that we've got this turnover of people that understand the industry issues and will work for us. And I think that's got to be done. This doesn't happen overnight, but if you can get one friendly MP, one friendly politician, it'll grow after that. And you need them. We all need them. Trade Union Network, I mentioned the TUC in the UK, it's the Trade Union Congress, it's all of the unions. So through them, we belong to them, and through them we can lobby on general issues like pension issues, like sort of looking at public services, health services, education across the board, not specifically to do with music, but general stuff that helps all working people. So we get involved with that. And I'm on the executive committee of the TUC, which is about 20 general secretaries like me. We make sure we have regular one-to-one meetings with politicians as well as the group. So we'll arrange to meet politicians that are willing to talk to us. There's a new Minister of Culture in the UK, just been appointed since Theresa May took over in the debacle after Brexit. We'll see if she'll talk to us. Often the Conservative politicians don't want to talk to the unions. They try and stay away. But we'll talk to if the Labour Party in the UK get its act together, we'll talk to somebody there. But at the moment, you don't know who to talk to. And we are continually issuing press releases and media releases about whatever issue we're dealing with at the moment. So we kind of have a department, small department, 3 people, who have contact with specialist music journalists, but with ordinary, I say ordinary journalists, but more political journalists who actually put things out when we talk about the state of the arts and the state of our members and what we're looking for. So that was a kind of whistle-stop tour about what services we can offer. And, you know, I just got to emphasize again what I said before. This is sophisticated. This didn't happen overnight. I've been in charge for 15 years. We've developed things like the public liability and the equipment insurance since then. But the other things, you know, we've been doing for years and years and years. This is kind of organic. It grows. Every now and again, you can add to it. You do it at no cost if you can. So you're not putting the money up for the members. You know, there's a ceiling of how much you can actually charge them. And it's continually looking to be inventive and to reinvent yourself, really. And what you've got to be is relevant to the members. You've got to be relevant to the musicians. And I think that's... so you've got to know what's going on in the music business. You've got to know how musicians earn their money. And you can't be complacent about this because it changes. And it's changed throughout the 15 years I've been doing it. It's changed immensely. you know, and it will change for the next person who does it after me. And I think you've got to be relevant. You've got to be able to speak the language of the contemporary musician just as much as the sort of 70-year-old jazz player who doesn't like rock and pop very much and thinks that we waste our time on them. So it's an operation that's good. It's an operation that's sort of successful. It's kind of tenuous. What we've tried to do is keep our independence as a musicians' union. Lots of other unions have gone into bigger ones. They've amalgamated to bigger groups, you know. So there's a little department of some big union that actually deals with performers. We don't want that. We want our own distinct identity, and we want to be regarded as, it's very old-fashioned to talk about a craft union, but this is a craft. This is a real skill, and we're talking about not just the stars, we're talking about what I call artisan musicians, workaday musicians who are jobbing musicians, earn their living, and they need representing. So it's, it's a continual battle, but it's quite fulfilling. I quite enjoy it, and but I'll be handing on next year. I'm going to retire from the British Musicians Union next year. I'll carry on as chair of PPL for a few more years, I hope, and I'll carry on as president of FIM for, I've been elected until 2020, so that's a while. So thanks for listening. I don't know if you've got any questions, or I think this is the opportunity to mop up on the whole of the session as well. I'll be in the hands of you, Erica and David, for that.
Sorry. I wanted to know, other than the support for teachers, music teachers, and support for the BBC, if you could maybe speak to a few of your priority lobbying areas or areas of concern.
Yeah, well, the BBC is kind of done and dusted now because there's been a settlement with the government, so we parked that one. It was a big campaign last year, and it's only just been resolved. The teachers one is a big issue, and that's still going on because music education in the UK, particularly teaching people to perform, to sing or to play instruments, is under great pressure, and it has been for a number of years, and it's not getting any better. So that's something we'll carry on with for a long while. One of the big things we talk to them about is access to finance and making regarding self-employed musicians as small enterprises. They put things back into the economy and giving them access for their own, I think it was in the Status of the Artist presentation, research and development. Governments are very keen on that, but somehow they don't regard it as a proper profession yet. And we're trying to really push this, that this is, the creative industries are massively important. You take the UK, music industry is incredibly important. It's not just about the money that comes through the economy, it's the reputation of the artists, it's the kudos, it feeds the tourist industry. People go to Liverpool to look at venues there, they go around country to festivals. So we're continually pushing issues like that. But I think what the main issue is recognition of the importance of arts and culture. And I think we'll carry on doing that. It's not something that's immediately on a politician's agenda. It doesn't win a lot of votes, I don't think,
I just noticed in your statement to members of 2015 that there's money allocated for a pension fund. Is that a pension fund for the members?
There are two pension funds we've got. One is for the staff, of course, and we have one for the members as well. We've got an agreement with the independent television production companies, with the BBC, with some of the opera houses. We've got 6 opera houses in the UK, have full-time musicians, and they pay in via the union into a fund. So again, we act as this kind of clearinghouse. So yeah, so it's kind of small beer. It's not a really big fund, but potentially it's something that should grow. Because I always say that we work very hard at getting people into the business and developing their careers. We're not very good at getting them out of the business and retiring, with dignity.
So that kicks in when they become a retirement age?
Yeah. And I think they can collect it when they're 65.
When they're 65?
Yeah. And
do
they
you
can
have to
carry
be a
on working.
member
They get
for
taxed
so
on.
many years?
No.
So
you
you
just
could
have to
join
have
at 60
a pot of money. Yeah.
You could join at 60 and...
Yeah, you won't have much money in the pot, but yeah.
Oh, it builds over the years.
Builds over the years, yeah.
Proportionally to
Yeah.
having been there.
Yeah. But it's potentially, it's very important. Yeah.
In the case of Barbadian artists, I find a lot of artists want the opportunity to go outside of Barbados and perform. And you had mentioned before that your union helps with the connection, sending. So how do you do that?
We give them advice about touring, about what they should look out for. That's in many ways the easy thing. But we've also, through the Federation, we've got a network of organisations around the world. If they get into trouble, so if there's a British musician working in the States, they can actually get in touch with the AFM if they've got a problem. And this might be a problem. We had, where were they from? We had some European musicians, I think from Hungary, working in Manchester, and they needed a piano tuner. It was all, they got to the venue, the piano was terrible, they wanted to use. And so we provided one, we got somebody. So there's an infrastructure when people are away from home. Also, if things go wrong and somebody gets ill, we can liaise, and we can liaise with their body in their own country to see what we can do about it. And we've done that. So there's a kind of network. So they got to know they're supported wherever they go. I've got to say, the touring circuit for musicians is pretty good around the world. I was involved in some similar sessions as these in the Philippines a number of years ago, and we had actors and dancers and singers and instrumentalists there. So we're doing all performers. And there's some really ridiculous, for dancers it's really terrible. It's when they get on a cruise liner and these, I can't remember which country, I think Japan, and they take the passports off them, is the first thing they do. So you're trapped. And they, it's almost, it's appalling. And these are young people who are very vulnerable. So we kind of have a network of people watching out for them at ports and all the rest of it. So I keep saying that the entertainment business is a risky business, and there's all sorts of risks. And all you can do is just tell people about best practice, what to watch out for. But yeah, there's a support mechanism.
Yes, I wanted to speak to the lobbying, and I noticed you had the two sections there of lobbying with the government. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how are you getting that first section of the group that you, so to speak, are vetting? Are you doing a general sort of information like, okay, we want to see what parliamentarians are interested in culture, you see who comes to them, and then are they your foot soldiers? Are you getting them one by one? Are you relying on your partners? How are you going about creating the lobbyers?
It was a bit of it. Forming the group was a bit of each. We started by announcing it, and we had a session. We got some artists, we got some actors actually to come along and talk to them. Musicians don't like making speeches, and actors do, so we relied on them. And we got about 6 or 7 to that first meeting. They all joined up. Word spread. We do mail shots out to them. We put on events. We had a particular event where we had, in association with PPL, we did some jazz sessions and the jazz awards that we had there. So, and you get the politicians interested, and maintaining the interest is difficult. So you've got to keep going on about it. But yeah, and then we get our own friends. We get relationships with politicians, and our members know them. And they say, you ought to phone so-and-so, and we do.
Yes. Can I just add that I think one thing which is international is that politicians enjoy being associated with famous people. So when you're in music, when you're in acting, you tell politicians they're going to be famous people present at an event, they will turn up. Politicians are very, very good at seeking publicity vicariously. So, if you have committed musicians, committed actors, they will get politicians along to events, and that's when you start to befriend them.
Yes, when you tell the politicians, make sure you bring your camera. There's going to be a camera opportunity. They love having their pictures taken with some actress they've seen on the television. They're all smiles. And then you collar them, and you talk about the issue that you want. But yeah, it develops. I mean, it started off with about half a dozen. As I say, now it's about 100 we got involved. And that's still a minority, and they don't turn up to every meeting. There's a core that turn up. But yeah, they're good friends. And I think you need those good friends in all parliaments. They're the ones who are going to help us. So, Erica and David, I don't know if you had to do a kind of summing up. We're coming into the final stretch.
I'm more tired than you guys, so I'm at the back looking at everybody. So, if there are no further questions on any of the thematic areas that have been presented by either Keith or John over the past couple of days, then what I would like to do is to take this opportunity to thank all of you for attending. But there are a couple of things that I want to request of you before we head off. One is I really do need for